I've been thinking about how I can help you while you're off school, and what I've decided to do is record a series of short videos that you can access through this blog, and I'll cover as many of the poems as I can, some parts of Jekyll and Hyde, and some parts of Inspector Calls. You can use these videos in a variety of ways. You can use them for revision, or it might be the first time that you visited some of these poems, in which case you might be able to take some really useful notes. Can I suggest that you stop now, pause the video, and print yourself off a copy of The Soldier? Okay, today the poem that we're going to be looking at is The Soldier by Rupert Brooke. The Soldier is an incredibly famous poem, perhaps one of the best known of the war poems. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam. A body of England's breathing English air, washed by rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think this heart all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights, her sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven. Okay, let's get started. If you have studied this poem before, can I suggest you stop the video at this point and see if you can complete these notes without any reference to outside help. Don't use your English book, don't use a CGP guide. See what's stuck in your memory. If you have not studied this poem before, can I suggest this layout for your notes? You could use the same layout for every one of the poems, and this would give you more than enough to answer questions in a GCSE exam. So let's get started. The Soldier was written in 1914 by Rupert Brooke, a young man who was clearly patriotic. Brooke died in 1914 before the worst effects of World War I became apparent, certainly before the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and trench warfare. We know now, with hindsight, some of the horrors that World War I brought to the world. Poison gas, tanks, barbed wire, landmines, flamethrowers, all used for the first time in this horrific war where industry was used to kill more people more efficiently. Of course, Brooke didn't know this. At the time he was writing the poem, the country was incredibly optimistic. People believed the war would be over by Christmas of 1914, and like all young men of his time, Brooke was raised to see serving England as a duty. That leads to the particularly optimistic and patriotic tone of this poem. Let's get started. Your first language point. If we look at the poem, we can see that England is repeated throughout the poem. In fact, 6 times, the repetition of England or English, showing that it's the most significant thing for Brooke. We can see that it shows the importance of his country. By contrast, Brooke mentions himself only in the first line. If you were to make a point drawing that contrast to the examiner's attention, you'd have a really strong language point. Mentioning himself only once, but England 6 times. It clearly shows where he believes his duty lies. Language point 2. Let's look at some of this language. We've got rich and richer dust, flowers to love, blessed, dreams as happy as her day, laughter learnt of friends, gentleness, hearts at peace. This is clearly very optimistic language, not what we would necessarily expect in a war poem entitled The Soldier. This shows Brooke's overall thoughts on the war. He's clearly drawing as little attention to the horrors of war as he possibly can. In fact, if we think back to the previous slide, he doesn't even admit the possibility that he will die. It's if I should die. So we've got a second language point. The semantic field of positive language is opposite to what we would expect from a war poem, shows Brooke's optimistic approach. The third language point. We've got this idea of a dust whom England bore. Well, bore means carried and gave birth to. And then we see the pronoun her used throughout the poem. So we've got the personification of England here, but not just as any human being. Here we've got the personification of England as a mother, a defenceless woman who requires the support of her children. We see that Brooke shows it's his duty to protect England, as many young men at the time would have been brought up to believe that it was their duty to protect a helpless woman. If we look particularly at this idea of a body of England's, we can see that Brooke doesn't feel his own body belongs to him. His body belongs to the country, to do with as England sees fit. So he's not giving up a life that is even his. He's simply giving up a life that is a part of England. Moving on then to the structural points of the poem. Well, this poem's clearly a sonnet. And it's one of 5 sonnets that Brooke wrote at this time. In fact, this is number 5. And we know that sonnets, with their 14 lines of iambic pentameter and their rhyme scheme, are the traditional way of writing a love poem in the English language. If you wanted to write a poem to someone to tell them of your romantic attachment, you would choose a sonnet. Here, Brooke chooses this traditional form of romantic poem to emphasise the love for country. We call that patriotism. There's your first structural point. And then I'm particularly interested by the final 2 words in the poem, English heaven. Brooke leaves us right at the end of this poem with this idea of an English heaven. Now, while I am not myself religious, I know for certain that heaven's supposed to be where for all nations. Here, Brooke's clearly taking an opposite view to that. He's suggesting that heaven's, well, either for just English people or that there are separate heavens for the different nationalities. This doesn't seem to be the message that the Bible gives. And to us today in 2020 can seem a little bit jingoistic. So that's your second structural point. Brooke reflects the optimism and patriotism of his time. We can't stand here and criticise him from the viewpoint of 2020 with the hindsight of the horrors of World War I. When Brooke was writing, he didn't know what the war was going to bring. He was dead before, like I say, the horrors of trench warfare, the Battle of the Somme, and all of the other deaths that occurred in the war. So is Brooke pro-war or just patriotic? I would argue that Brooke is patriotic. I don't believe he's writing a poem that encourages war, but he is encouraging young men to defend their country. He clearly believes it's his duty to die for England. In 1914, this would have captured the mood of the time exactly. People would have seen this as patriotic and would have loved the poem for that. In 2020, with hindsight, knowing what we know about World War I and its horrors, it is possible to see this poem as a little bit jingoistic. It can seem to us a little bit, overly patriotic. A lot of people link Brooke with Jessie Pope, and I believe that's unjust. Jessie Pope was a propaganda poet, and she was writing for a reason. Brooke's writing from his own point of view, his own patriotism. Yes, this poem would definitely encourage people to join the army and serve their country, but I don't believe that that's Brooke's primary intention. And so I would see him as different from Jessie Pope. Some extra research for you. Perhaps you could look into Jessie Pope's Who's for the Game for a little bit of deeper understanding. I hope this has really helped you understand this poem and that you'll find this video useful. Thanks a lot.